She arrived at the old Willow Creek homestead with a weather-beaten canvas bag and a belly 8 months round. There was no one waiting. She had no destination, carrying within her 2 children whose own father didn't want to know them. The man who swore to stay by her side vanished one ordinary morning, like someone stepping out for salt and never returning. And when Aurora pushed open the creaking gate and saw the white ewe, scrawny and alone in the pasture, bleating for a lamb that was no longer there, she understood without anyone needing to explain. Both had been abandoned by those who should have stayed, and it was in that forgotten homestead, nestled between the whispering boreal forest and the vast silence, that everything began to change. If you've ever felt like life pushed you to a place that seemed like the end, but turned out to be exactly the beginning of everything, comment below from where you are watching this. Write your city and province, because this story was made to reach where people need it. Like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next tales. In remote hamlets, in other times, stories like these were told between lakes and winding dirt tracks. Aurora was 23 years old and possessed that quiet fortitude known only by those who learned to fend for themselves early on. She wasn't a woman to cause a fuss or demand what the world wouldn't offer willingly. Her maternal grandmother, Ilara, had raised her. Ilara, a woman with calloused hands and a heart the size of the patch of land, where she raised her hardy chickens and sold homemade preserves every market day. Aurora's mother died of fever when she was still a 4-year-old child, the kind of fevers that arrived without warning in the wilderness and left, taking people with them. Her father was never more than a name no one spoke, because Ilara always said that a man who flees from his child isn't worth the effort of remembering. The girl grew up between the local trading post and the wood-fired stove, learning to mend with threadbare scraps, to make nourishing stews from humble provisions, and to measure people with a glance before listening to what they said. Ilara had that gift of teaching without grand speeches, solely by example, and Aurora absorbed everything with that quiet intelligence that goes unnoticed until the day someone needs it. When her grandmother passed, Aurora had just turned 20, and the pain of that loss was the kind that made no sound. It simply settled in her chest and changed the color of all the mornings that followed. Providence took the only person she had in the world, and Aurora remained standing, because Ilara had never taught her any other posture. Alone, with no relative appearing and no land of her own, she took work as a laundress and seamstress in the homes of the village families. She slept in a small room at the back of a lodge that charged little and offered less, saving coin by coin with that discipline known only by those who understand the world, gives nothing freely to those who carry no family name of influence. She lived like this, balanced on that thin line between dignity and destitution, until the day Ethan appeared in her life. And he appeared the way problems often do when they disguise themselves as solutions. Ethan was the son of a prosperous logging magnate from the region, a young man with a new Stetson and polished cowboy boots who appeared in the village every week with the air of someone who owned a piece of the world. He had an easy smile, smooth conversation, and the self-assurance of a man who knew exactly what to say to a woman who hadn't heard pretty words in far too long. Aurora wasn't foolish, but she was alone in a way that ached to the bone. And loneliness possesses that invisible malice of making one see water where there is only a mirage. Ethan courted her with calculated patience. He'd appear with wildflowers from the meadows at the lodge door, wait for her outside the houses where she worked, and speak of a future with a conviction that almost deceived even himself. The relationship lasted as long as such things do when one of the two is lying from the start. Aurora gave herself because she believed. And she believed because she needed to believe that Providence had not taken everything from her without leaving something in its place. When the pregnancy came, the village doctor examined her carefully and said they were twins. Aurora felt the ground open and close at the same time because it was terrifying and beautiful, to a degree she couldn't separate. She left the clinic with her hand on her belly, which was barely showing, and went to find Ethan to tell him, already imagining his face, already rehearsing her smile, already building in her head a scene that never happened. Ethan's house was closed, windows without curtains, the yard swept clean of any trace, the door locked with that silence of a place no one intends to return to. A neighbor, with that compassion disguised as gossip found in every small village, told her he had left 3 days prior to marry the daughter of a wealthy timber merchant from another valley, a family arrangement made months ago. All the time he swore his love under the lodge's old oak. He already had a fiancée waiting in a neighboring settlement. Aurora heard this standing with her hand on her belly and didn't cry in front of anyone, because Ilara had taught her that tears in front of others become currency for exchange. The following months carried a weight that went beyond her growing belly in a village where everyone knew everyone. A pregnant woman, alone, carries the burden of a judgment no one verbalizes aloud, but which is heard in every glance, in every calculated silence when she enters a store, in every conversation that dies when she passes by on the street. The matron of the big house where Aurora worked most often, a woman of rigid posture and unbending opinions, dismissed her one Monday morning with a coldness that hurt more than any shout. She said a girl in that condition could no longer serve in her house, that the neighbors were talking, and that she had her own reputation to protect. And so, one by one, the doors that supported Aurora closed. 8 months pregnant, jobless, without income, the lodge money dwindling, and 2 children moving inside her, as if already in a hurry to enter the world. Aurora made the only decision she had left. She packed Ilara's old leather valise. Inside, she put 2 changes of clothes, the crocheted shawl her grandmother had made, sewing scissors, and a small vial of healing salve she used on her belly. She walked out the lodge door one morning, the sky still dark, without telling anyone, without looking back, because looking back would have demanded a courage she was saving entirely for what lay ahead. She walked all morning along a gravel track, at the slow pace her belly allowed, stopping when her body asked, sitting on stones by the roadside, the valise on her lap and her hands on her belly, feeling the children stir, as if wanting to help their mother decide which way to go. She knocked on 3 doors along the way. At the first, the woman saw her belly and closed the door without opening her mouth. At the second, a man said he couldn't help and went back inside. At the third, a woman brought her a glass of water and a piece of cornbread, but made it clear with downcast eyes that her own house was already full of problems. Aurora drank the water, ate the bread standing on the step, thanked her, and kept going, because going forward was the only direction that existed. The afternoon fell with that weight known only to country afternoons, a heat that clung to the skin and made the air seem solid. The cicadas were already humming before the sunset, and Aurora continued along the path with a slowness that was no longer choice, but the body's limit. She no longer cried. Not because she was fine, but because she had reached that point where even crying expended energy that simply wasn't left. Only the sound of her own steps on the dirt, the rustle of the wind in the trees, and that question pushing at the back of her mind every time she tried to ascend. And it was then, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting everything in that golden tone of late afternoon, that she saw it. A roof, half hidden among the evergreens. The road curved at that point, and a little off the main track, down a dirt lane with old wagon ruts, the homestead appeared. It wasn't large or grand, a house with sturdy walls, closed windows, and a covered porch in front, surrounded by a packed earthyard. It wasn't in the best condition, that was clear, but it stood, and it seemed habitable, like a place someone had recently left, still holding the warmth of having been lived in. There was an ancient apple tree heavy with fruit beside the house, an elderberry bush in a corner of the yard, and at the back, a wooden fenced pasture where a white ewe moved restlessly, letting out bleats that cut the twilight silence with an urgency that seemed like a plea. Aurora set her valise on the ground and stood there, looking at that ewe as if the two recognized something in each other that needed no explanation. The animal was scrawny, its udders visibly full and swollen, meaning it had recently lambed and someone should be milking it, but no one was. It bleated, looking around for something, and Aurora understood before thinking. It was looking for its lamb. A dairy ewe without a lamb beside it is a mother who lost her child, or whose child was taken. And that bleating wasn't a bleat of hunger, it was a bleat of one separated from its own blood. Aurora felt her eyes burn, in a way that had nothing to do with the day's weariness. She placed both hands over her belly, where her children stirred, and looked at that animal bleating alone in a pasture. And she thought that perhaps Providence had a strange way of bringing the abandoned together, of pushing one towards the other, so that none would be entirely alone. She entered the property slowly, found the well with water, found the house door unlocked, found rooms with simple furniture still in place. She returned to the pasture, filled a bucket with water from the well, and took it to the ewe, which drank with a heart-wrenching anxiety. Then, to the apple tree, she picked 2 ripe fruits that fell almost on their own, sat on the homestead porch with her back against the wall, and ate right there, letting the juice run down her chin without caring, because the sweetness of that apple after a whole day's journey tasted of something more than just ripe fruit. It tasted of Providence. That night, Aurora found an iron bed in one of the rooms with a thin straw mattress that still served. She lay down with the valise beside her, feeling the twins quiet for the first time that day, as if they, too, knew they had arrived somewhere. Through the pane of the window, a patch of sky full of stars entered. More stars than she saw in the village, because there was no light competing with them there. From the pasture, the ewes' bleating still came occasionally, softer now, as if the presence of someone in the homestead had calmed something in her too. Aurora didn't know who owned the land, didn't know if she could stay, didn't know what the dawn would bring. But there, in that instant, with her body exhausted and her children quiet inside her, she fell asleep. And it was the first full sleep she'd had in weeks, as if that homestead with all its mysteries had decided to protect her before she even asked. What Aurora didn't yet know was that that homestead held a story as heavy as her own, that the ewe in the pasture was the last vestige of a life that had crumbled within those walls, and that the owner of that land, a man named Owen, had not abandoned the place out of neglect, but out of a pain he could no longer face. But that she would only discover when the silence of that homestead began to reveal its secrets, one by one, like the earth reveals the seeds it kept in the darkness. The second day at the homestead began with the ewes bleating. Aurora opened her eyes before the sun, her body complaining from the uncomfortable night on the straw mattress, and the twins already awake inside her, moving with that restlessness of those in a hurry to exist. She lay for a moment looking at the room's ceiling, listening to the bleating coming from the pasture, and trying to organize in her head what she needed to do. The list was long and her body was tired, but Aurora had learned long ago that waiting for tiredness to pass was a luxury for those who had someone to wait with. She got up, washed her face with well water, and went straight to the pasture, because before taking care of herself, she needed to take care of that animal that had been alone there for, Providence knows, how long. The ewe received her with a softer bleat, different from the desperation of the previous day, as if it already recognized that someone had returned to pay attention to it. Aurora filled the water trough, pulled fresh grass from around the pasture, and put it inside for the animal to eat. Then she stood looking at the swollen udders and understood that she needed to milk it, because an ewe that isn't milked in time suffers and gets sick. She had seen Alara do that with a neighbor's ewe years ago and stored the gesture in her memory, as she stored everything her grandmother did with that attention of one who knows that someday she will need it. She sat beside the animal, rested her forehead against its woolly flank, and milked slowly, her hands clumsy at first, until the milk began to flow thick and warm into a bucket she found hanging on the fence. The ewe remained still throughout the milking with a docility that seemed like gratitude, and when Aurora finished and stood up with the full bucket, the animal nudged her arm with its muzzle and stayed there for an instant, with that simplicity animals have for showing thanks without complicating things. Aurora took the milk inside, drank a cup, and felt the warm liquid slide down her throat with a thick, sweet taste that, at that moment, was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life. She looked at the half-full bucket and thought of the children who were coming, and thought of the milk, and thought that perhaps Providence had not forgotten her, only sent help through a path she would never have expected. That morning Aurora explored the homestead with different eyes. No longer the eyes of one seeking refuge for a night, but those of one who needed to understand what that place had to offer. The house was simple, with thick, sturdy walls, 3 rooms, a kitchen with a wood-fired stove, and a porch facing the yard. It wasn't in perfect condition. It had a window with loose wood and a leak in the corner of the smallest room, but it was habitable, it was solid, it was more than she had anywhere else in the world. The yard had the large apple tree laden with fruit, the elderberry bush, a small vegetable patch at the back with rhubarb stalks starting to yellow, and near the well, a patch of wild mint that grew without asking permission, releasing that clean scent Alara said was a remedy for almost everything. Also leaning against one side of the house was a small wooden shed with a sliding door, where she found old tools, coiled rope, a ladder, and a hammock stored inside a burlap sack. But it was at the back, next to the pasture, where Aurora stopped. There were the remains of a garden with furrows marked by stones, overgrown with weeds, but still with the visible shape in the terrain. And within one of the furrows, insisting on living without any care, a chive plant and a dill plant had spread on their own, sprouting with the stubbornness of things that refuse to die. Aurora knelt there with difficulty due to her belly and ran her fingers over the dill leaves that released a strong, vibrant scent. There was something in those plants surviving in a place everyone had left behind that spoke directly to something within her. The earth hadn't given up even when people had, and if the earth didn't give up, she wouldn't either. On the 3rd day, the visitor arrived. Aurora was trying to light the stove with some dry twigs she had gathered in the yard, when she heard footsteps on the patio, firm steps of someone who knew the ground they walked on. She stood up slowly, went to the kitchen door, and saw a woman standing in the middle of the yard, looking at her with an expression that mixed surprise and a curiosity that made no effort to hide. She was a woman in her late 60s, her face weathered by the sun, white hair pulled back tightly in a bun, a straw hat on her head, and a canvas satchel hanging from her arm. She had small, attentive eyes that seemed to miss no detail of what she was seeing, and a bearing of one who carried authority without needing to announce it. The woman said her name was Agnes. She lived about 2 kilometers away, along the forest trail, and had come because she saw smoke rising in the direction of the homestead the day before and wanted to know what was happening. Because no smoke had risen from that homestead in over a year, she said it with the objectivity of one who needs no circumlocution to ask what she wants, and waited for the answer with the patience of one who has all day. Aurora responded with the same frankness, because she had no energy to embellish anything. She said she had arrived 2 days prior, that she was taking refuge, that she didn't know who owned the property, and that she hadn't touched anything that wasn't necessary for survival. Agnes listened without interrupting, lowered her eyes to the 8-month belly, returned to Aurora's face, and remained there for a moment, measuring something only she understood. Then, without a word, she entered the kitchen, opened her satchel, and took out a package of cornmeal, a piece of cured bacon, a jar of wild honey, and a bundle of herbs tied with twine. She placed it all on the counter with the naturalness of one restocking a pantry, and said that the stove lit better if the thinner kindling was placed below and the thicker pieces on top, and that the cupboard drawer held matches stored in a jar that she herself had left there months ago. Aurora stood looking at that woman who had arrived unbidden, listened without judgment, and solved the coffee problem before anyone asked, and felt a knot rise in her throat that wasn't sadness. It was the immense relief of one who discovers she isn't completely alone in the world. Agnes stayed all that morning. She showed Aurora how to light the stove correctly. They made coffee with toasted cornmeal. She walked around the homestead, commenting on what she saw with the precision of one who understood the land and life in the wilderness. She said the well was good, that the house's structure was solid, that the leak in the small room was easily fixed with a repositioned shingle. She said the wild mint in the yard was a blessed remedy for the last months of pregnancy, that it calmed backaches and helped one sleep when the weight of the belly wouldn't allow it. She said all this with the same naturalness with which she had spoken of the stove, without any hint of favor, without any shadow of pity in her eyes, only with the practical wisdom of one who has seen much in this world and knows that most people's suffering doesn't need advice, it needs company. It was before leaving that Agnes told Aurora about the homestead, and Aurora listened, her heart tightening with each sentence. The property belonged to a man named Owen. He had inherited it from his parents and had lived there with his wife Magda for 8 years of a marriage the entire neighborhood considered blessed. The two had built that homestead together, log by log, furrow by furrow, and the white ewe Aurora now cared for had been Owen's gift to Magda on their first wedding anniversary. Agnes recounted that Magda called the ewe Serena because she was the gentlest and calmest animal they had ever seen, and that when Serena lambed, Magda cared for the lamb as if it were her own child because the real children they so desired weren't coming. Aurora already felt the weight of what was coming before Agnes finished. Magda finally became pregnant after years of trying, and the joy in that house was of a magnitude only those who have waited long can measure. But the birth went wrong. It went wrong in a way that even the experience of Agnes, who had been the region's midwife for decades, couldn't reverse. Magda died in that very house, in the back room, and the baby did not survive. Owen was devastated in a way that went beyond normal grief. He was left as men are left who have built their entire life around one person and suddenly find themselves in a house where every corner reminds them of what no longer exists. Owen's brother came to fetch him 2 weeks later and took him to the city. Owen left without resisting, like someone who no longer had a will of their own to offer. Before leaving, he asked a neighbor to take care of what remained at the homestead. The neighbor sold the chickens, sold Serena's lamb, because it had market value and was easy to transport, but the mother ewe stayed because she had an infected hoof that prevented her from walking well, and the neighbor promised to come back for her later. He never returned. Serena remained locked in the pasture, surviving on the grass that grew between the fence slats and rainwater that collected in the trough, her udder full of milk that no one milked, and bleating for a lamb that had been taken forever. Agnes would pass by occasionally to toss water and grass over the fence, but age and distance allowed her no more than that. She had done what she could and prayed that Providence would send someone. Aurora listened, sitting on the porch bench, her hands on her belly and her eyes burning. She thought of that ewe who had lost her lamb and carried milk without having anyone to give it to. She thought of herself, pregnant with two, about to be a mother, without a drop of certainty about tomorrow, and thought that there was a meeting there that neither of them had planned, neither she nor the animal, but which bore the mark of those things that seem like coincidence and are not. Agnes, as if reading her mind, told her before leaving that Owen hadn't appeared in over a year, that he paid the land tax by mail, but never again set foot on the homestead, and that for now Aurora was safer there than anywhere else. She said that and walked down the trail with the calm steps of one who knew every stone on the path, leaving behind the scent of herbs, and the feeling that something had been sown in that conversation. The days that followed were filled with work. Aurora couldn't stay still, and her body, heavy at 8 months, obeyed the will to do with a resistance that surprised even her. She cleaned the house room by room, not because it was in a state of complete abandonment, but because it had that closed-in dust that needed a living hand to awaken. She washed the floor, opened the windows for the wind to enter, fixed the loose wood with nails she found in a tin in the kitchen corner. She repositioned the shingle that caused the leak with the help of the old ladder leaning out back, climbing with the care her belly demanded, and descending with the relief of one who had solved a problem with her own hands. The kitchen received special attention because that was where the homestead's life revolved, and the wood-fired stove, following Agnes's instructions, began to light on the first try every morning. Agnes returned 2 days later, as if they had agreed, though they had agreed nothing. She brought beans, a piece of cured cheese wrapped in cloth, and a sprig of wild thyme with its root in a clump of earth. She said that wild thyme was the first thing to plant in a new garden because it took easily, scared away insects, and made a tea that solved half of the body's ailments. They planted the sprig together beside the chive and dill plants that Aurora had cleared in previous days. And Agnes approved with a nod the work that had been done in the house. It was during these visits, between garden work and the wild mint tea they drank sitting on the porch, that Aurora slowly recounted her story. Not all at once, not with drama, but in the way that true things emerge when a person can no longer bear to carry them alone. And Agnes listened with that silence, that is the opposite of emptiness, a silence full of presence, of attention, of a wisdom that knows that most of the world's pain doesn't need opinion, it needs a witness. The routine took shape, as everything one repeats with intention does. Aurora awoke with the first light, milked Serena, made coffee, tended the garden, worked in the house. The ewe had become a constant companion, following Aurora around the yard when she was loose, nudging her belly with an insistence that had something of tenderness and instinct mixed. Serena's milk was thick and good, and Aurora learned with Agnes to make a fresh cheese that lasted 2 days, and which, along with the cornmeal and fruits from the yard, formed the sustenance of those days. The garden began to respond to the care, with a generosity that seemed to want to compensate for lost time, and life in that homestead slowly organized itself with the patience that good things demand. Slowly, without promise, but with firmness. It was in the second week that Aurora first heard the sound of pack horses on the trail. A packhorse driver was passing through with half a dozen laden mules, making his way between the settlements, as men of that old trail did, carrying goods from one place to another along paths only they knew. The man stopped at the homestead entrance and asked permission to water his animals at the well. Aurora saw him from the yard and went to the front. He was a man in his late 30s, perhaps older, with broad shoulders, a face weathered by the sun and the trail, large, calloused hands of one who spends his life gripping rope and rein. He had a quiet manner that wasn't rudeness. It was simply the way of one who was used to living more with animals than with people. He said his name was Lachlan, and that he passed through that stretch every 2 or 3 weeks, carrying cargo to the region's settlements. Aurora gave him permission for the mules to drink, and stayed nearby while the animals rested. Lachlan looked around with that discreet attention of one who evaluates a place by what it reveals and not by what it pretends. He saw the cared-for garden, the house with open windows, the ewe grazing freely in the yard. He looked at Aurora with her 8-month belly and asked nothing that wasn't about the water and the trail. And in that silent respect of not invading what didn't belong to him, there was something Aurora registered without being able to name. Before leaving, he asked if she needed anything from the village. Aurora said no, and he nodded and continued with his pack train, and the mules' hooves disappeared in the dust of the road until silence returned. Agnes, who learned of the visit the next morning, as she learned of everything within a 20 kilometers radius, told her that she knew Lachlan. He was a widower. His wife had died some years ago of a slow illness that gradually took her, and since then he lived on the trail, passing from settlement to settlement without rooting anywhere, sleeping in trappers' cabins and waking before the sun to continue his journey. Agnes said that in the tone of one merely informing, with no intention behind the words, but Aurora perceived in the old midwife's eyes a discreet spark of one paying attention to what Providence was arranging without anyone asking. But it was in that same conversation that Agnes brought another piece of news, and this one came with a different weight. There was an influential timber baron in the region named Sterling Thorne, a man of money and influence, owner of a large general store and lands that bordered Owen's homestead. Agnes recounted that Sterling Thorne had had his eye on that property for years, that he had made purchase offers at least twice, and that Owen had rejected both without explanation. She said that Sterling Thorne was not a man to accept a no calmly, and that since the news of a woman living on the homestead began to circulate in the village, he had been asking questions about the situation, about who Aurora was, about what right she had to be there. Agnes told all this in the low, firm voice of one not spreading gossip, but giving warning, and finished by saying that Aurora should be careful, because a man with money and ambition was the most dangerous combination in the wilderness. Aurora listened and absorbed. She had other, more immediate urgencies. The twins were getting heavier, backatches were constant, and Agnes, who examined her belly with the seasoned hands of one who had brought more than 100 babies into the world, said the time was approaching, that it could be a matter of weeks or less. Aurora's body seemed to agree because everything became slower, heavier, more difficult. But she didn't stop, because stopping was a luxury, and because manual labor was the only remedy she knew for the fear that grew within her in the same proportion as her belly. The fear of giving birth alone, the fear of not being able to manage too, the fear of losing that roof before having something she could call her own. Lachlan passed by the homestead again 2 weeks later, as he said he would. This time he brought, unasked, a small sack of salt, a coil of rope, and a packet of heirloom vegetable seeds that he said he had been given at a store and had no use for on the trail. He left everything on the porch with that economy of gestures of one who does good without fanfare. He watered the mules, exchanged few words with Aurora about the weather and the trail, and continued his journey. But before leaving, he looked towards the pasture, where Serena grazed peacefully, and said, almost as if talking to himself, that it was good to see that homestead alive again. And he left without waiting for an answer, because a man of that type doesn't wait, he just speaks and goes. Aurora stayed on the porch watching the pack train disappear and felt, without wanting to feel, without being prepared to feel, that something in that quiet man with large hands left a presence at the homestead that lasted longer than the visit. She shook off the thought like one shakes dust from clothes, and returned to the garden because she had no time or space in her life to harbor that kind of sentiment. Not now, not with 2 children on the way and a roof that wasn't hers. But the thought remained there, quiet in a corner she pretended not to know, waiting for the right moment to return. And that night, as she milked Serena under the first stars, with the warm milk falling into the bucket and the twins moving as if dancing inside her, Aurora thought of everything that had happened since she walked out the door of that lodge with the valise in her hand. She thought of the journey, of the closed doors, of the ewe bleating alone, of the milk that now sustained her and sustained the life growing within her, and she thought that perhaps life had not finished punishing her, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was just beginning to ask for forgiveness. What she didn't know was that Sterling Thorne had already made a decision, and that the next time a horse stopped in front of that homestead, it wouldn't be bringing seeds or water for the mules. Sterling Thorne appeared one Wednesday afternoon without warning, mounted on a well-groomed horse and accompanied by a younger man who followed silently. He was a man in his 50s, with the paunch of one who eats well and without haste, a wide-brimmed hat, and the kind of smile that arrived before the person and was already sizing up the terrain. He entered the property as if entering his own land. He dismounted with the calm of one certain that the world works as he wishes, and he walked to the porch where Aurora was sitting, mending a tear in one of the clothes she had brought in her valise. He introduced himself by name and merchant title, as if that were a calling card that opened any door, and began to speak of the homestead with a familiarity that didn't belong to him, commenting on the fence, the yard, the quality of the soil with the tone of one evaluating merchandise before making an offer. Aurora did not get up from her chair. She continued sewing with a steady needle, and her eyes on the fabric, listening to every word with that attention Alara had taught her, the attention of one who doesn't need to look to see. Sterling Thorne spoke of the homestead for a few minutes, praised the work she had done in the yard and in the house, and then got to his point with the subtlety of cattle passing through a narrow gate. He said that Owen was thinking of selling the property, that negotiations were underway, and that when the sale was finalized, she would naturally have to vacate the premises. He said it with a smile that tried to appear amiable, but which held a calculating coldness behind it, and waited for her reaction like one who throws a stone into a river and watches the ripples. Aurora finished the stitch she was making, cut the thread with her sewing scissors, folded the fabric on her lap, and looked up at him for the first time. She asked him if Owen had told her that personally. The question was simple, but it carried a weight Sterling Thorne didn't expect, because it was the question of one who knew how to distinguish truth from maneuver. The man hesitated for a second, just a second, but Aurora saw it. He said they had spoken recently, that things were moving in that direction. Aurora replied that when Owen came personally to tell her that, the conversation would continue. Until then, there was nothing more to talk about. Sterling Thorne's smile lasted a moment too long. One of those smiles that lingers on the face after it has lost its reason, and then it vanished. He looked at her with different eyes, recalculating something internally, and said she was a woman of strong opinions. He said it as if it were a defect. He mounted his horse and left with the young man behind him, and Aurora remained on the porch with her sewing in her lap, and her heart beating faster than she let show on her face. That same night, as she milked Serena by the light of an oil lamp she had found in the pantry, Aurora felt true fear for the first time. Not the fear of the road, which was the fear of having nowhere to go. This was different. It was the fear of having found a place and someone wanting to take it from her. It was the fear of one who had begun to root and felt the earth tremble beneath her. Serena, as if sensing something, leaned her body against Aurora's arm and stayed there with that gentle presence that was her way of saying she was with her. Aurora finished milking in silence. She took the milk inside, stored it in the coolness of the pantry, and went to lie down with her hand on her belly, quietly asking Providence to give her at least a little more time in that homestead before the world decided to collect its due again. Agnes learned of Sterling Thorne's visit before the sun rose the next day, because in the wilderness, news travels faster than a winter storm, and she appeared at the homestead with an expression of one already prepared for a serious conversation. She sat on the porch with Aurora, drank the coffee that was already ready, and said what needed to be said, that Sterling Thorne had lied, that Owen had not authorized any sale, that she knew this because Owen's own brother lived in the same logging town. Agnes visited once a month to sell cheese at the market, and that if there had been any movement of sale, the brother would have mentioned it. Sterling Thorne was pushing on his own, betting that a pregnant woman alone would not have the courage to resist. Agnes said that with a contained indignation that was more powerful than any shout, and then she said she would send word to Owen's brother so he would know what Sterling Thorne was doing. The following weeks were filled with a tension that ran beneath the surface like a hidden river current. Sterling Thorne did not return personally, but he began to act through other means, spreading rumors in the village that there was an invader at Owen's homestead, that the situation was irregular, that this property was being occupied by an unknown woman. The gossip reached Aurora through Agnes's visits, who relayed it with concern and at the same time with a cold anger of one who knew the game and refused to accept it being played against the weak. One morning, Aurora found the entrance gatepost scored with some sharp blade, a small but deliberate mark, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. She looked at that mark and felt her stomach tighten because she knew it was a message, and messages of that kind don't come alone. Lachlan appeared that same week at his usual time with his pack train of mules and the calm gait of one who has no fixed schedule with the world. Aurora saw him arrive from the garden where she was working and felt, before any thought, a deep-seated relief that came from the depths of her chest, as if the presence of that man brought with it a security she hadn't asked for, but needed more than she would admit. Lachlan watered his mules, sat on the porch bench that Aurora had cleaned and restored, and accepted the coffee she prepared for him without him asking. They stayed there for a while, he sitting and she standing at the kitchen door, in a silence that was anything but empty. It was the kind of silence where two people remain together, because the presence of the other already says what needs to be said, and talking would almost be an interruption. It was that day that Aurora noticed Lachlan's gaze at the mark on the gate when he arrived. He didn't comment on anything, didn't ask anything, but before leaving, after having stayed longer than usual, he said he would start passing through every week instead of every 2 weeks, because the trail in that stretch needed more attention. He said it as if it were about the trail. Aurora heard it as if it were about the trail, but both knew it wasn't about the trail. And there was in what was left unsaid a gentleness that was more significant than any declaration, because it was the gentleness of protecting without invading, of being close without imposing, of caring without demanding recognition. On that visit, Lachlan brought 2 kilograms of rice and a tub of lard, that he said he had received as payment for a delivery. He left it on the porch beside the bench and didn't expect thanks, because he wasn't a man to expect anything from the world. But when he left and the mule's hooves disappeared around the bend in the trail, Aurora held the tub of lard in her hands and a warmth in her chest that she already knew, that she had felt before, and that the other time had been a lie. But this time was different. It was different because Lachlan promised nothing, swore nothing, embellished nothing, with words he didn't intend to keep. He simply appeared, did what he could, and left. And in that simplicity there was a truth that Aurora, after everything Ethan had done to her, recognized as the rarest and most valuable thing that existed. If you're hoping Aurora manages to protect everything she's built, like this now, and share this story with anyone else who believes starting over is possible. The days shortened, and Aurora's body grew heavier in a way that changed every gesture, every step, every breath. Agnes now came almost every day, checking her belly with firm hands and a pressed ear, and said that both babies were well positioned, that the moment was approaching, that it could be any day. Aurora felt it in her body before hearing it from the midwife, because there was a new urgency in the twins' movements, a restlessness that seemed like a hurry. She continued working because she didn't know how to live otherwise, but she went slower, stopped more often, breathing deeply, leaning against the kitchen wall with her hands on her back, which ached constantly and dully. Agnes prepared the back room with clean cloths, boiled water stored in jars, and a herbal tea that she said was for the time. And she taught Aurora to recognize the signals, the difference between practice pains and true labor, because with twins the body gives earlier and stronger warnings. It was on a night of a full moon that Sterling Thorne returned, and this time without the smile. He was accompanied by 2 men. Aurora didn't know and stood in the yard with a different posture, harder, more determined, like one who was tired of negotiating and came to deliver an ultimatum. He said, with a voice that no longer tried to be cordial, that there was a formal process underway to challenge the unauthorized occupation of the property, and that Aurora had 1 week to leave willingly before the authorities would decide for her. It was a lie. Aurora was almost certain it was a lie, but a lie spoken with authority in the middle of the night by a man accompanied by 2 strangers carries a weight that truth takes time to balance. She felt the twins move strongly within her, as if they sensed the threat through her blood, and placed her hand on her belly in a gesture that was protection and prayer at the same time. Before she could respond, footsteps were heard coming along the forest trail. Agnes entered the yard with her satchel on her arm and stopped when she saw the men. In the last few weeks, with the birth so near, the old midwife had made it a habit to pass by the homestead every night before dark to check that Aurora was well and that her body had shown no signs. That night, like all the others, she had come by the forest path with the punctuality of one who takes her task seriously. She assessed the entire scene with those eyes that never missed anything. She walked until she stood beside Aurora and remained there, standing, without saying a single word. She was just an old woman with a canvas satchel, but there was a firmness in her shoulders that occupied space in a way the 3 men felt. Sterling Thorne looked at the 2 women, looked at Aurora's belly, and said she would regret complicating things. He turned and left with the 2 men, and the sound of the horses blended with the silence of the night until they disappeared. Agnes held Aurora's arm and led her inside. She made wild mint tea, placed it in her hand, and sat on the other side of the table with no rush to leave. She said she would send an urgent message in the morning, that Sterling Thorne had no power to remove anyone from there, and that the bluster of a rich man without papers in hand was just wind. It made noise, but it didn't truly knock down walls. Aurora listened, holding the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth of the tea on her fingers, and trying to believe it was true. But it was when she was about to answer that she felt the first pain. It wasn't the backache she already knew, nor the discomfort that had accompanied her for weeks. It was different, deeper, more profound, more insistent, a pain that came in waves and that, when it passed, left her entire body waiting for the next. Aurora closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and told Agnes that it might be good for her to stay close. The old midwife looked at her belly, and said she already knew it before entering the homestead that night, as if Providence had sent her exactly at the right time, as it always did when one paid attention. The night closed over the homestead as the pains grew stronger and closer. Agnes worked with the calm of one who had been through this so many times that tranquility had become a tool, the most important a midwife could have. She prepared everything in the back room, heated water on the stove, organized the cloths and herbs, and told Aurora, in a voice firm and gentle at the same time, to breathe deeply when the pain came, to release the air slowly when it passed. that the body knew what it had to do, even when the mind doubted. Aurora gripped the edge of the cot with her hands and endured the pain in the way women have always endured the pain of the things that matter most, gritting her teeth, yielding when the body commanded, fighting when it was time to fight. The first cry tore through the early morning near 2 a.m., thin, strong, furiously alive. Agnes smiled with that relief and celebration combined and said it was a boy. She wrapped the baby in a clean cloth, placed him on Aurora's chest for an instant, and returned to work, because the second one was coming right behind, and it did. 20 minutes later, another cry filled the room, sharper, more impatient, as if the girl was in a hurry to catch up with her brother who was already outside. Agnes received her with the same firm hands, cleaned her, wrapped her, and placed her beside the first in Aurora's arms, who looked at those two tiny, perfect, wrinkled faces with an expression no word in any language could translate. She named the boy Thomas, the girl Louisa. She had kept the two names for months, without telling anyone, as if naming them too soon was a risk she couldn't take. Now the names emerged from her mouth, soft, testing the sound, and they fit perfectly, like things that had always been waiting to be spoken. Agnes left the room to give them the silence that moment demanded and went to tend the stove. And Aurora stayed there with her two children on her chest, listening to their breathing, feeling their weight, crying for the first time in months, not from sadness, not from fear, but from that cry that comes when the body finally understands that the most difficult part has passed, and that what arrived was good, but the most difficult part had not passed. The morning brought with it a reality Aurora had not foreseen. The twins nursed, but her milk was not enough for two. Thomas, who was larger and stronger, nursed with vigor, but Louisa remained restless, crying with that weak cry of hunger, which is the most distressing sound a mother can hear. Aurora tried everything she knew, and everything Agnes taught her, different positions, massage, compresses, stimulating tea, but her body, exhausted from childbirth and months of scarcity, simply couldn't produce enough to feed two mouths. Louisa cried, and each cry was a knife in Aurora's chest, because there was no greater helplessness in the world than having a hungry child and being unable to quell that hunger. It was Agnes who said what had been there from the beginning, waiting to be seen. She looked at Aurora with those eyes that carried decades of wisdom, and said that the answer was in the pasture, that Serena had plenty of milk, thick and strong milk, and that dairy ewes had nourished babies since the world began, that she herself had been raised on ewe's milk because her mother hadn't had enough, and that that animal was not there by chance. It was there because Providence knew, before anyone, that that milk would be needed. Aurora looked out the room's window, saw Serena in the pasture with a full udder, and understood in that instant, with a clarity that cut through her chest, that the ewe who had lost her lamb and the woman who didn't have enough milk for her own had been placed on the same homestead for a reason larger than any coincidence. She got up with difficulty, still sore from childbirth. She went to the pasture with the milking bucket and sat beside Serena. The ewe remained still, gentle as always, and the milk flowed thick and warm. Aurora took it inside. Agnes carefully warmed it and gave it to Louisa in a small wooden cup with a clean cloth stopper for the milk to drip slowly. The girl drank with a pure urgency, and when she finished and fell asleep with that peace of one whose belly is finally full, Aurora rested her head against the wall and cried again. But this time, it was gratitude. It was a gratitude so profound, it swelled in her chest and needed to escape through her eyes. Serena, the ewe who had been abandoned without her lamb, came to feed the children life had given Aurora. Twice a day, morning and night, Aurora milked with care, and Serena's milk was what kept Louisa strong and alive, while Aurora's body slowly recovered. There was a beauty in this that went beyond what could be described with words. A mother who lost her lamb, giving milk for the children of another mother who had no one. Agnes said it was Providence, that Providence wastes nothing, neither pain, nor milk, nor loneliness, and that everything that seems lost is only being kept for whoever will need it later. The first days with the twins were of an exhaustion Aurora didn't know existed, a tiredness that went beyond the body and entered the soul, but which was mixed with a joy she also didn't know existed, because no one teaches you the magnitude of love one feels for a child until the child arrives. Agnes appeared every morning, helping, teaching, verifying that all three were well. And it was on the third day after the birth, when Aurora was nursing Thomas on the porch, while Louisa slept inside a basket Agnes had brought, that the sound of hooves on the trail made her heart race. But it wasn't Sterling Thorne, it was Lachlan. He came alone, without his pack train, mounted on a borrowed horse with a haste that didn't match his calm manner on all other days. He dismounted before stopping completely. He tied the animal to the post and walked to the porch with long strides. He stopped when he saw Aurora with the baby in her arms and stood there with an expression on his face he clearly hadn't planned to show. Agnes had sent him a message the day before. Aurora didn't know it. She hadn't asked, and she looked at the old midwife inside the house with a gaze that was both question and answer. Lachlan stood looking at Thomas in Aurora's arms. Then he looked inside the house where Louisa slept in the basket, and something in his face changed in a way that had no turning back. It was the expression of a man who carried an old loss and who suddenly, without warning, was confronted with something that seemed to fill the exact shape of that emptiness. He said nothing for a time that lasted longer than any words. Then he asked, his voice hoarse as if controlling something vast within his chest, if she needed anything. Aurora said she needed cut firewood, and he went to cut firewood, as if it were the most important task he had ever received in his life. What neither of them knew that morning was that Sterling Thorne had already taken the next step, and that what came next would demand of everyone a courage they had not yet had to demonstrate. Lachlan didn't leave that day. He cut firewood until the sun set, stacking it under the back roof with the meticulousness of one who orders the world with manual labor. And when he finished, he sat on the porch, sweat dripping, and accepted the coffee Aurora brought him, without him asking. They stayed there in the twilight silence, he with the cup in his hands, and she with Louisa in her arms, listening to the cicadas begin, and Serena chewing grass in the pasture. They didn't talk about Sterling Thorne. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't talk about anything that weighed more than that moment could bear. And when night fell, Lachlan said he would sleep in the back shed if she allowed it, because the return journey was long and the mules were resting in the village. Aurora allowed it without argument, because arguing would have been pretending she didn't want him to stay, and she was tired of carrying unnecessary weight. The next morning, Aurora awoke to the smell of freshly brewed coffee coming from the kitchen. She got up slowly, her body still sore from childbirth, and the night broken by the alternating cries of the twins. And she found Lachlan in the kitchen, with the stove lit, the water boiling, and a cup already placed on the table, as if he had done it all his life. He didn't say good morning with words. He said it with the gesture. And in that simplicity there was an intimacy that had arrived without asking permission, and that seemed more true than any oath Aurora had ever heard. Thomas cried in the room, and Lachlan made a move to go see. He stopped halfway, as if realizing that might be crossing a line, and looked at Aurora, waiting. She nodded, and he went and returned with the child in his arms, with an awkward and careful manner that was both endearing and beautiful to behold, the way a man too large carried something too small and treated it as if it were the most important thing in the world. Agnes arrived that morning and found the scene without any surprise on her face, as if she already knew she would find exactly that. She sat on the porch, drank the coffee. Lachlan served with the same naturalness with which he served it on the trail, and then called Aurora to speak in the yard, away from his ears. She said she had sent word to Owen's brother about Sterling Thorne's moves, and that the reply had come by word of mouth from an acquaintance who had passed by the previous day. Owen's brother was alarmed, said Owen had not authorized any sale, and that Sterling Thorne was acting on his own, but he also said that Owen was in a difficult situation, living in a lodge room in the city, with his health broken, and no will to return to the homestead where he had lost everything. Agnes recounted this in the low voice of one carrying heavy information and knowing she had to deliver it carefully. And she finished by saying that someone needed to go to where Owen was before Sterling Thorne went first and got what he wanted, taking advantage of the fragility of a broken man. Lachlan heard everything when Agnes repeated it to him on the porch with Aurora beside him and the twins asleep in the room. He remained silent for a while, elbows on his knees and eyes on the homestead earth, and then said he knew the city where Owen was. He passed through there with his pack train at least once a month. He knew the lodges, he knew the trails. He said he could go. He said it with the same voice with which he said he would cut firewood or water the mules, without weight, without drama, as if going to look for a stranger in a distant city to resolve the destiny of a woman he had no obligation to protect was simply the right thing to do. And it was. Aurora looked at him and felt something settle within her chest with the solidity of things that are true, like a house foundation that doesn't tremble when the wind blows. Lachlan left the next morning, before the sun, with the borrowed horse and the quiet determination of one who doesn't need to announce what he is going to do. Aurora watched him leave the yard from the kitchen window with Louisa in her arms, and stood there for a while after he disappeared around the bend in the trail, feeling his absence with an intensity that scared her, because it was proof that that man had occupied a space within her that she didn't even know was empty. Agnes, who stayed at the homestead during Lachlan's absence, sleeping in the hammock in the living room, and caring for the twins with the competence of one who made it her vocation, said one of those nights, as the two drank wild mint tea on the porch, that Lachlan was a rare man, that a man who cares without asking for anything in return is the kind Providence makes few of, because the mold is difficult and the material is precious. Aurora listened and didn't reply, but she smiled in the darkness in a way that Agnes saw even without light. The days of waiting were long, in a way known only by those who have waited for something that can change everything. Aurora cared for the twins, milked Serena, maintained the garden, made cheese with the leftover milk, and tried not to think too much about what would happen if Lachlan didn't find Owen, or if Owen didn't want to come, or if Sterling Thorne acted before anyone. Thomas and Louisa grew with that astonishing speed of the first days, gaining weight, gaining strength, filling the homestead with the sounds only a newborn makes, that mixture of crying, sighing, and silence that changes the air of any place. Serena continued to give milk with a generosity that seemed boundless, and Aurora milked twice a day with an affection that went beyond the practical gesture, because that ewe had become part of that improbable family, in the same way that she herself had become part of that homestead. Sterling Thorne appeared on the 5th day, mid-morning, and this time he came alone. He brought no smile, no direct threat. He brought something worse. He brought a paper. He stood in the yard, dismounted, and showed Aurora a sheet that he claimed was an eviction notice issued by the village authority, with a 3-day deadline for her to leave with everything she had inside. Aurora looked at the paper, her heart pounding in her ears, and didn't know in that instant if it was true or false. Agnes, who was inside the house, came out to the door and asked to see it. She looked at it carefully, slowly, turned it over on both sides, and then looked at Sterling Thorne with that expression only an old countrywoman knew how to make. The expression of one who has seen much falsehood in life and recognizes the scent from afar. She said that paper had no seal, no judge's signature, and no validity whatsoever, and that if Sterling Thorne wanted to remove anyone from there, he would need much more than a sheet written by himself at his store's counter. Sterling Thorne turned red, not from shame, but from fury, the fury of one unaccustomed to meeting resistance where he expected fear. He said they were making a mistake, that he had means they couldn't imagine, that it wasn't going to end like this. Agnes replied that he should do what he believed he must, but that as long as she was alive in that region, no one would remove a mother with 2 newborns from a home out of land greed. She said it with a voice that didn't tremble once, and with a gaze that made Sterling Thorne avert his own. The man mounted his horse and left without looking back, taking the useless paper and the certainty that these 2 women would not yield easily. Aurora felt her legs tremble when the horse disappeared down the trail. Agnes held her arm and told her to stay strong, that help was on its way, and that Providence had not brought her this far only to let her fall. Lachlan returned on the 7th day, and he did not return alone. Aurora was milking Serena in the pasture when she heard the sound of 2 horses at the homestead entrance. She stood up slowly with the milk bucket in her hand, and her heart rising to her throat, and saw Lachlan dismounting beside a man she had never seen. He was a man in his 40s, thinner than he should have been, with stooped shoulders and sunken eyes, like one who had slept little for too long. His face was marked not by the sun, but by something internal, that kind of weariness that isn't of the body, but of the soul. Aurora knew who he was before any introduction, because there was in that man's gaze, when he stopped at the entrance to the yard and stood looking at the house, the yard, the garden, a pain so visible it was like reading a letter written in large script. Owen was back at the homestead he had abandoned, and what he found there was not what he expected. They were not walls that held the memory of Magda covered in dust and silence. They were open windows, a swept floor, a lit stove, the smell of coffee and wild mint in the air. It was a living garden, where before only weeds had remained. It was baby clothes fluttering on the line. It was a white ewe grazing peacefully in the pasture, the same ewe he believed had long since died. Owen walked through the homestead slowly, hands in his pockets and eyes glistening, looking at every corner like one re-encountering a beloved face that had changed, but was still recognizable beneath the changes. He entered the kitchen, saw the cup on the table, the stove with embers, the herbs hanging to dry on the wall. He entered the back room and stopped at the door when he saw the basket where the twins slept side by side with that absolute peace of newborns who did not yet know the weight of the world. He stood there for a time no one measured. Lachlan was on the porch, standing in silence. Agnes was in the kitchen, quiet, and Aurora was in the yard with the milk bucket still in her hand, waiting without knowing what to expect. When Owen came out of the room, His face was wet, and his expression changed, as if something that had been locked inside him all that time had finally found its way out. He walked to the yard where Aurora was and stood in front of her without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, his voice choked as one speaking over a knot in his throat, that he had believed that Homestead was dead, that he had left because he couldn't look at those walls without seeing Magda in every corner, without hearing her voice in the kitchen, without smelling her scent in the room where it all happened, and that he had believed abandoning it was the only way to bear the pain. But he was wrong. That Homestead was not dead. It was waiting. And that Aurora had done what he hadn't had the courage to do. She had brought life back to a place he had let die of sorrow. Aurora listened to every word with an attention that went beyond mere hearing. She saw in that man a pain she recognized, not identical to her own, but made of the same cloth, the pain of one who lost solid ground and had to learn to tread elsewhere. She didn't say everything was fine, because it wasn't, and simplifying the pain of others is a disrespect disguised as kindness. She only said that the homestead was his, and that she had known it from the first day. Owen looked at her. He looked towards her belly, which was no longer a belly, but 2 children sleeping inside the house. He looked at Serena in the pasture and said that the homestead was his on paper, but that what was there at that moment was hers, that he had come to resolve 2 things. The first was Sterling Thorne, and the second was to ensure that Aurora would never again have to fear losing that roof. Owen went to the village the next day. Lachlan went with him because it wasn't time for anyone to go alone. They went to the land registry office, and Owen formally declared that the property was not for sale, that there were authorized occupants on the homestead, and that any attempt at negotiation by third parties was null and without consent. Then they went to Sterling Thorne's general store, and Owen, who was a quiet man of few words like Lachlan, told the merchant, in a voice that didn't need to be loud to be firm, that if he ever again set foot on that property or bothered anyone living there, the next conversation would be with a lawyer from the big city whom Owen's brother had already consulted. Sterling Thorne listened with a clenched jaw and did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he recognized, perhaps for the first time, that he had found a wall that would not yield. The news spread through the region with the speed that news travels in the wilderness, fast for the bad and slow for the good, but this time it was the opposite. Agnes made sure to tell anyone who would listen that Owen had returned, that the homestead was legally occupied, and that Sterling Thorne had received a definitive no. The true version gained ground over the gossip, and Sterling Thorne's silence after that day confirmed what everyone already suspected, that he had bluffed from beginning to end, and that his bluff had been called. Owen stayed at the homestead, not because he had planned it, but because it happened, in the way that the right things happen when one stops forcing and lets life find its own rhythm. The first few days he slept in the back shed, quiet, working alongside Aurora and Lachlan, not talking much, rediscovering every corner of that land, with the slowness of one who was relearning to be in a place that caused him pain. But it was Serena who made the difference. The first time Owen entered the pasture after returning and the ewe approached him and nudged his hand with her muzzle, the man stood there for a long time, caressing the animal that had been a gift for Magda, and that had survived abandonment in the same way the homestead had survived, waiting. Agnes later said that it was at that moment Owen decided to stay, because Serena had done what no words could. She had shown him that the love he had for Magda didn't need to be erased for life to continue. It just needed a new place to exist. The months passed with that speed time has when life is full of things worth living for. Thomas and Louisa grew strong, nourished by Serena's milk, and by the care of an entire community of souls who didn't share blood ties but had something that is sometimes stronger. Owen became a kind of unofficial grandfather, recognized by all, carrying the twins in his arms with an awkward care that grew natural with time, building carved wooden animals with hands that before only knew how to build fences and furrows. The garden doubled in size with everyone's combined effort, and the first sales of cheese and vegetables at the village market brought in a small sum that Aurora kept in a jar in the kitchen drawer, with the seriousness of one who had never in her life had control over a single cent of her own. Lachlan stopped traveling. He didn't announce it, made no speech. There was no solemn moment of decision. Simply, his absences became shorter, his returns quicker, his excuses to stay more frequent, until one ordinary day, he was there in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and the next day too. And no one asked why, and he didn't explain, because it wasn't necessary. He sold his pack train to a younger man who was starting in the trade, and with the money, he bought new tools, seeds, fence wire, and a wooden cradle that he himself made for the twins, with the meticulousness of a carpenter no one knew he possessed. The conversation between him and Aurora never happened with grand words. It happened one moonlit night, the two of them sitting on the porch with the twins asleep and Serena ruminating in the pasture, when he said he wanted to stay, not stay for now, not stay until he sorted out his life, stay for real. He said it looking straight ahead at the yard, silvered by the moon with that direct voice that was the only way he had of saying difficult things. Aurora remained silent, holding her coffee cup, feeling the weight of those words and the weight of the answer forming within her. She said she would stay, but that he needed to understand one thing, that she had come from a life where she had no voice, where she had no space, where she had learned to shrink herself to fit into the worlds of others, and that she could not and would not return to any version of that, no matter how beautiful it seemed. Lachlan turned his face towards her and said he knew it, that he had seen it in her from the first time he stopped at the homestead to water his mules, and found a woman 8 months pregnant, caring for a lone ewe as if she were caring for the whole world. He said the homestead was hers as much as anyone's, and that what he wanted to build needed both of them standing tall, not one in the other's shadow. Aurora listened to all this, weighing each word, searching for the trap life had taught her to expect. She found none, and there, on that porch, with the scent of wild mint in the air and the stars above the roof, she let the fear go with the night wind. Life at the homestead slowly organized itself, as things built with honest toil and the patience of one who is not in a hurry to harvest what they sowed do. The house received curtains that Aurora sewed with fabric bought at the market, pots of fragrant herbs at the entrance that perfumed those who arrived, and the facade painted with a white wash that Owen prepared, and Lachlan applied one sunny Sunday, transforming those walls into a reflection of what was happening inside them. The garden grew to become a reference in the region with beans, squash, tomatoes, dill, chives, and Agnes's herbs, which Aurora learned to cultivate and use with the same wisdom the old midwife transmitted in each visit. Serena continued to give milk with that constancy that was almost a miracle, and the twins grew attached to her as if the ewe were part of the family, because she was. Agnes continued to come 2 or 3 times a week, with her satchel on her arm, and that discreet smile of one who looks at life and sees that every now and then things fit together the way they should. She wasn't a woman to say she was right, but her eyes told it every time she saw Lachlan carrying Thomas on his shoulder, while Aurora planted with Louisa tied to her back with a rebozo, and Owen sat on the porch carving a wooden toy with a knife and whistling a song no one knew, but that sounded like something that had returned from afar. One Sunday afternoon, with the sun painting the yard golden and the twins crawling across the patio with that determination of those who want to know every inch of their world, Aurora stopped in the middle of the garden with her hoe in hand and looked around. She saw the white house with open windows. She saw the old apple tree heavy with fruit. She saw Serena grazing with her usual gentleness. She saw Agnes on the porch with her tea in hand. She saw Owen on the wooden bench with Louisa in his arms. She saw Lachlan fixing the back fence with his sleeves rolled up and sweat on his forehead, and thought of the morning she left that lodge with a weather-beaten canvas bag and an 8-month belly, and no certainty other than that she couldn't stop walking. She thought of the doors that closed, of the long road, of her aching feet, of the fear she didn't want to articulate. She thought of the twilight when she saw that roof among the trees and of the ewe bleating alone in a pasture waiting for someone who didn't arrive. And she understood with that clarity that only comes when time does the favor of showing the complete picture, that none of it had been coincidence, that the homestead had not been an accident on the road, but the destiny that was waiting for her, that the ewe who lost her lamb and the woman who had no one were placed on the same ground, so that neither would be left entirely alone, and that the family she now had, made of people who didn't share blood, but shared something that is sometimes stronger, had been born there on that homestead, in the same way that things that truly matter are born, slowly, with pain, with toil, and with a beauty that only those who have been through the worst can truly see. Memories, like the stoutest pines, grow from the very earth, from a weather-beaten canvas bag carried by hands that didn't know where they were going, from an ewe that lost her lamb and found 2. There are strengths that only appear when one believes they have lost everything, and places that seem forgotten by the world, but that are only kept by providence for whoever will need them at the right moment. Aurora didn't choose that homestead. It was the homestead that chose her, and perhaps life works that way with everything that truly matters. One doesn't find the path finds you. If this story touched something within you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the wellspring of kindness never runs dry, that love is born in the most improbable places, and that sometimes the family you need is the one you build with your own hands. Until the next tale.